Greetings to everyone from, yes, a still very snowy Boston. Thank you to everyone around the globe for joining us for today's webinar, Emotions in Coaching. My name is Stephanie Gerard, and I am the Manager of Education, Research, and Marketing at the Institute of Coaching. And we are so fortunate to have with us today Robert Biswas-Diener to present along with the Institute's Jeff Hull acting as moderator. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few logistical details. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send them to us via the webinar question function, and Robert will try to respond to your questions throughout the duration of the webinar. Due to the high participation today, all attendee audio has been muted to avoid any background noise. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the library section of the ICPA website within a week. There will be a survey following the webinar, and we'd appreciate it if everyone would complete the survey. If you wish to receive any CEUs, the completion of the survey is obligatory. And I would now like to hand it over to Jeff for introductions.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everyone. My name is Jeff Hull. I'm the Director of Education here at the Institute of Coaching, and I am very excited to have Dr. Biswas-Diener with us today to talk about a subject that he was just asking me who was very likely to be in this webinar. And I think it's safe to say that this topic, emotions in coaching, is relevant to all of our 1,200 coaches that we have as members of the Institute of Coaching, and that ranges from health and wellness coaches to life coaching to leadership coaching, education coaching, and certainly this topic is one that is applicable to just about every professional subset of the coaching field. So before I turn it over to Dr. Biswas-Diener, I'd like to just give you a little bit of his background and a little sense of the structure that we're going to have over the next hour and 15 minutes together. So what we'll do is I'm going to hand the webinar over to our presenter, and he'll take us through a series of slides and information. And at various points, we've discussed having 2 or 3 pause points during the webinar in which we will try to share specific questions with him and give him an opportunity to dialogue with you. So as Stephanie said, throughout the webinar, please do send your questions. She will forward them to me, and I will try to get in as many questions as possible. We will collect the questions, however, so any of you that feel like your question didn't get answered or notice that we didn't have time, we will have a list of questions that we can pass on to Dr. Biswas-Diener, and he'll be able to respond to you and stay in dialogue. So let me share a little bit of his background before I turn it over to him. Dr. Biswas-Diener is one of the foremost authorities on positive psychology coaching. He's consulted with a wide range of international organizations on performance management and talent development, and he conducts trainings, webinars, and live trainings on coaching, strengths, positivity, courage, and appreciative inquiry with organizations and businesses all around the world. Dr. Biswas-Diener has trained professionals in America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, South America, and the Middle East. I think that pretty much covers everywhere. He has a doctorate in social psychology, a master's degree in clinical psychology, and is an ICF certified coach. He's the author of Practicing Positive Psychology Coaching, The Courage Quotient, and The Upside of Your Dark Side, among many other books. Needless to say, we are thrilled to have an expert in emotions and the application of them to positive psychology and coaching today. And I want to welcome Dr. Biswas-Diener, and Robert, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you who are listening in right now for thinking that this might be a useful way to spend an hour and a quarter of your time. I can tell you that that's no small thing to me, that I hugely appreciate it, the opportunity to share some insights with you, provoke some new thinking, or offer some fresh perspectives, which is my aim. A couple of quick comments before we start. I'm a little bit sick. I woke up with a pretty sore throat. My wife reassured me that it actually is the best thing that could possibly happen to me. She said, oh, your voice is so baritone right now. It is so, like, it is so kind of deeply radio ready. That's like the perfect opportunity for you to do this sort of voice-only presentation. So I just want you to know that that I'm really appreciative of the fact that I have this cold. But if I have to duck out for a glass of water, please don't think me unprofessional. I just want to give you a little bit of context of why I sound so awesome right now.
Well, Robert, I'll pipe in and just say you do sound great. And I'm sorry to hear that you're maybe a little under the weather. So please do let us know if you'd like to take a break or a pause. We will obviously have questions, and I'm happy to jump in and let you have a moment to have a glass of water or whatever's needed. So take care of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Jeff. I do have a glass of water with me, so I did show up prepared. So no worries on that count. I also want to mention a quick point of pedagogy. Like you, I also attend many webinars, and I know what it's like to be on the listening side. I know in particular how tempting it is to check your email, check your Facebook, pull out your cell phone, check your texts, and I just recommend that you shut all of that down right now. I read a study recently in which students who just had their cell phones out performed less well on learning tasks, although their confidence that they were performing well increased. So even as their actual performance went down, their belief in their performance went up. Wherever you are, try and make this the object of your full attention, and I promise you in return I will do exactly the same. I will not be texting during the course of this presentation, checking my email or my Facebook. I'm going to talk with you today about a topic that is intensely passionate for me, a huge topic of interest, and one that I think is not entirely well covered in coaching, and that, of course, is the role of emotions in coaching. Obviously, when we think about coaching, if I were to say, do coaches ever spend time or attention thinking about goals or motivation? The obvious go-to answer would be yes. Coaching is, as a professional endeavor, very goal-centric. It is predicated on intense attention to motivation. And of course, motivation and emotion are linked, and I don't want to somehow overstate the case or pretend like coaches are not paying attention to emotion, because I think, in fact, we are. However, as a topic of research scrutiny, as a topic of professional training, I believe that there are more question marks about the role of emotion in coaching than there are answers. That is, I think that we sort of shoot from the hip and give a nod to this exciting topic from time to time, but I do not necessarily think that we have plunged into it and drawn from the well all the water that we might. In the course of the presentation today, I've divided it into 4 different portions. I'm going to start by talking about emotions specific to coaching. That is, I don't want to jump into emotion theory or anything like that. I just want to place emotions in the context of coaching. Some of these things are opinions. I'll present some research and some survey data to you. I want you to know that my goal today is not to convince you that I'm correct. You're going to come at this with your own personal experience, your own reading and interpretation of the professional literature, with your own sort of clinical and professional expertise. I am not a tent revivalist. I'm not here to convert you to my way of thinking. I simply have on offer for you some information, some personal opinion, some personal perspective, and feel free to accept it or reject it as you see fit. I want you to take what is useful to you. I'm not trying to somehow coerce you or convince you with a mountain of data. I just have things on offer to you. So I'm going to start with the coach-emotion relationship. I will stop at that time and I'll ask for questions. I certainly want to give you the opportunity to interact as much as possible. From there, we'll shift to part 2. That has to do with the psychology of emotion. Here I will veer from coaching as a context into sort of a brief history of psychological theory and research on emotion, what it is, what it's useful for, what people have said about it. We will, again, stop for questions before shifting into the third portion. I want to teach you one emotional skill. It is a skill related to emotional intelligence, but as a subsection of emotional intelligence. Some of you may be familiar with it, and my guess is many of you are probably not. And we'll actually do an activity at that point, so hopefully you have a paper, pen, something to write with. You'll actually want to be able to write. Again, turning to pedagogy, people who take notes electronically get less out of it than people who handwrite. So I always recommend handwriting to you as a way of learning. We'll take discussion items there before shifting to our final topic. Wait a minute, there's other types of emotions? And hopefully you're curious about that between now and then. And we will stop again at that time for discussion. So without further ado, let's launch in. Many of you will recognize this very, very famous series of photographs depicting the research of Paul Ekman. Ekman, quite famous in emotion research, and one of the figures like Freud or Maslow, who's even known outside of psychology by many people. Ekman, his original claim to fame was traveling overseas to tribal people in the South Pacific and presenting to them photographs of classic facial expressions and sort of proving, and I'm putting the word proving in verbal quotes here because that's not really what he did or what science is about, but basically offering evidence for the idea that many emotions are not just cultural constructions. Certainly there is a cultural element to emotions, and we will talk about that. But many emotions are part of our DNA. They are genetic, they are deep-seated, and we have universal expressions. The reason why we would have universal expressions is because there is a social component to emotion. Emotions are wonderful about communicating about the quality of events of daily life to each other. So if you look in the upper left-hand photograph of this woman with the long blonde hair parted in the middle, if I were to ask you, what do you think she is expressing? Which emotion is on her face? Most people get it right. They think that she's mad. You might label it as angry or irritated, something along the anger continuum. And it's helpful for people to be able to do that because anger in many ways does have the social component. You're essentially signaling to others, hey, you might not want to approach me. You have others, disgust and surprise, sadness, joy, and all of these have signal value. So I just want to offer, first of all, that there are a lot of different ways to think about emotion, and one of them is in what emotions do. And I think lots of people have sort of folk theories about this, that emotions are a way we communicate to one another, maybe that emotions prep us for motivation, that is, they push us towards certain actions. So you likely think that emotions do something, that is, they're not just happenstance. One of the things I think is interesting, though, is just not to ask the question, what about the very fundamental nature of emotions, but where, in fact, do emotions figure into coaching? Because if emotions are deep-seated, if they're universal, if despite the fact that there's cultural variation in the expression of emotion or even in the experience of emotion, it's true that all humans experience emotion, it necessarily means that emotions come up in our coaching session. And in fact, a lot of what we do is addressing emotions. A client might suggest that they are afraid of failure, afraid of success. They might suggest that they are hopeful, passionate, excited, and so forth. So in 2010, there was a sort of an initial exploration of the role of emotion in coaching. It was published in Coaching, the International Journal of Theory, Research, and Practice. If you don't currently read it, I recommend it to you. I definitely think that a great part of coach training is keeping up with research and theory, specifically out of coaching psychology. I will tell you, in this particular study, it was a relatively very experienced coaches who were certified by one of the major bodies, for example, the ICF. And basically all of the coaches said, yeah, I think that the emotion is important to coaching somehow. Most of them said emotions are valid. That is, they seem to be accurate or true. Mostly people are good at reporting their emotions. But how and whether the coaches actually attended to emotions during the session was largely predicated on how they thought about the distinction, the professional distinction between coaching and psychotherapy. So you can see here in front of you, this is sort of the classic distinction. You yourself have undoubtedly thought about the distinctions between coaching and psychotherapy. There's the sense that coaching is somehow present-focused and therapy is more likely to work with historical contexts and experiences. That therapy is largely centered around emotion, the processing of emotion, catharsis around emotion, building emotion regulation skills, turning dysfunctional emotion like depression or clinically relevant anxiety into more manageable emotions, things like stress, which we would view as a non-clinical emotion. I hold this out to you because I actually think that it hints at one of the reasons why emotion is not always spoken of in coaching circles with that label as emotion, because I believe that in our efforts to draw a clear delineation between our profession and that of mentorship or psychotherapy, we sometimes are shy of grabbing onto things that might seem to be the domain of psychotherapists, and I think emotion is one of these issues. I do think that therapists have legitimate criticisms of coaching, that I think that some coaches, especially those who practice on their own in silos without collaboration, without peer supervision or actively engaging in individual supervision, are more likely to extend beyond the boundaries of their competency, are less likely to be able to really identify when an emotion is clinically significant versus not. But be that as it may, I think it is entirely valid for coaches to deal with emotion, much in the same way that I think that it is okay for managers or spouses or anyone to deal with emotion, because emotion is not the domain of psychologists. Emotion is just an everyday thing. It's like speech. We don't say, well, coaches can't use speech. Only speech pathologists have the right to use speech. In the same way, coaches have every right to focus on emotion, to talk about anger or fear or sadness or disappointment or hope or enthusiasm. And yet, I think sometimes we sell ourselves short. Many of you will be familiar with this very basic skill. I was trained in my own skills by someone who was CTI trained from the Coaches Training Institute. This idea of tracking energy, that you offer an observation to your client about quote unquote their energy. And I've always found it a bit curious that we call it tracking energy. The word energy for many people carries with it a sort of, to be honest, a new age connotation that's evocative of dolphins and crystals, this idea that somehow we're tracking energy. But really, I think what we mean when we say we're tracking energy is not something intuitive or abstract. I think it's something very, very physiological. We are looking at physiological activation. We're looking for more rapid voice, rising inflection in the voice. We're looking for squared posture, eyes growing wide, increased smiling, increased fluidity or sharpness, and hand gestures. We're looking for these sort of behavioral cues indicative of physiological activation. And oftentimes, that's just another way of saying we are looking for change in emotion. We are looking for a spike in physiological activation associated with high arousal emotion, or we're looking for dips or troughs in that emotional activation. And it's curious to me that we don't always just call it exactly that. So again, I don't want to paint a picture where I think emotions is a topic that coaches are ignoring, but I do think that it's something that we sometimes keep at arm's length, or we sometimes tiptoe around, but not always. You can see right here from the ICF's blog, here's a blog post called "Change is Emotional." The idea of going through change, any process of change, and I believe everyone on this line would think at least a portion of coaching is about ushering your clients successfully through change, with the idea that that change is a positive change or a desired change. Embedded in the idea and the title of this blog post is the idea that one of the ways we go through change is that it's emotional. Those emotions aren't always good. That is, sometimes we might experience negative affect or negative emotion. We might feel confusion. We might feel disappointment. We might feel a bit of apprehension. But all of those are an integral part of both how we learn and ultimately how we move forward. Now, I just want to stop very, very quickly and linger here for a moment, because I said something that I suspect will be off-putting to at least a few of you, so I want to address it right up front. I used the word negative emotion, and I know that raises hackles for some folks, so let's just deal with it head on. When I say positive and negative emotion, and you're going to hear me say that a lot today, and I will more or less use it as synonymous with positive and negative affect. I just want to use the less clunky psychological term and the more everyday term, positive and negative emotion. When I say the words positive and the words negative, I am not saddling emotions with a value judgment. It is not in the lay use of the word positive and negative. I'm not saying good emotions and bad emotions. I'm not even saying pleasant emotions and unpleasant emotions. I'm not saying desirable emotions or undesirable emotions. I am using the words positive and negative like you would describe either end of a battery. I don't think anyone here, if I said, oh, you want to load the positive end of the battery in first, someone would throw up their hands and say, what? How could you possibly say that? Why do you preference that end of the battery and think it's so much better than the other end of the battery? You understand that those are neutral descriptions simply describing valence, that is direction, and that those directions are antipodal to one another. That's all I mean with positive and negative emotions, that it's a useful way of parsing them into camps without any evaluation that one of them is somehow better than the other, which I flatly do not believe. So, with that in mind, let's look at some data that I collected. I want to be upfront by saying this isn't ironclad. I don't think it even points to a firm conclusion, but I want to hold it out to you nonetheless. After I'm done showing you the data, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for questions at that time. That'll kind of conclude the portion about emotions in the coaching context specifically. So what I did is I went out and I asked 375 coaches. About 25% of them were ICF certified coaches. The other 75% were not. They had been practicing years on average. I think the average length of practice was something like 6 years, if I'm remembering correctly. But 375 people from many different states in the U.S., many different provinces in Canada, and many different countries around the world. all of whom are experienced coaches. And I just asked them a variety of questions about their most recent coaching session. I asked them to rate their own sort of energy level. I asked them to rate the emotions that their clients expressed and so forth. So let's just take a quick tour of some of those results. I asked on a 1 to 7 scale about their agreement with varying variables. So 4, just so you know, is the neutral point. 4, the descriptor of 4 is neither agree nor disagree. So that is neutral. So anything above a 4 is increasing agreement, and anything below a 4 is increasing disagreement. So let's look at the very left-hand one, the very highest orange bar. I felt energetic and upbeat throughout my last coaching session. Coaches largely agree with that, almost a 6 out of 7. That is, they squarely say, I agree. I think that's good news for coaches. Coaches tend to show up and be energetic and upbeat. If we look at the other two, the brown bar and the blue bar, the two variables that coaches reported a lot of agreement, almost 6 and 5 respectively, my client expressed optimism during the meeting, and my client was cheerful and upbeat during the session. This suggests that being cheerful, upbeat, optimistic, these sort of highly aroused and positive emotions is something that coaches say is, yes, that exists, that's there. That seems to be descriptive of my most recent coaching session. Now, let's look at the two purple bars, the ones that hover around the 2. I felt that my energy and mood were lower than normal. Coaches are saying, no, absolutely not. My energy wasn't lower than normal, and I think that's good. It means that they're showing up energetic. I was more stressed than I typically am. No, not at all. I was not any more stressed than I typically am, and again, I think that's good. So I don't know that this says, oh, coaches are only positive, but I do think it says that they recognize a great deal of positivity in their session. Let's jump to one more slide, same 1 to 7 scale, 4, also the neutral point. Here is a dummy item in orange. I always want the best for my client. We definitely want coaches to say yes to that. I would be appalled if the coach said, actually, I'm looking for the worst for my client. So you can see they answered almost a 7 there. So yeah, I always want the best for my client. But let's look at the other squarely agreed upon variables. Here, the sort of salmon-colored variable in the middle. I believe that coaching works best when the coach maintains a positive attitude. There's a high level of agreement. It's about 5.5 for that. So coaches believe that part of their job and part of what facilitates good coaching is a positive attitude on behalf of the coach. I believe that a good way to move a client out of negative emotion is to allow them to vent. Yeah, they say I slightly agree with that. I try to facilitate more positive state in my clients, and the red bar says yes, almost a 6 there. Definitely agree with that. So again, we definitely see a leaning towards the positive. If we look at some of these very low bars, the sort of blue, purple, and maybe another shade of purple, we find something counter. I believe that coaching works best when the client's feeling happy. They did not necessarily agree with that. So while positivity seems to be generally good, happiness specifically doesn't seem to be the order of the day. I believe that coaching works best when I mirror the client's emotions. And here we get some slight disagreement. So it is unlike psychotherapy in that respect, where we think that we want to be present and feel with the client. I think coaches think I need to maintain positivity whether or not my client is expressing frustration or apprehension. My positivity, I can certainly have my heart go out to them, but my positivity in some broader sense is ultimately what's going to allow us to work through this and bring them back into the positive place where I want them to be. And then finally over here on the far right, I always let my clients know at the start of the session if I'm feeling, it's cut off, but basically if I'm feeling bad or if I'm feeling low. And I think that that's interesting, that this is suggestive that coaches are not doing much in the way of self-disclosure of their own emotional state. Now, as I interpret this, again, I don't think that this is definitive. I think it's just a broad survey. It's imperfect in many ways, but I think it's interesting because I think it hints towards a trend in coaching that we believe that we should be positive, that it is our role to be positive, that we don't need to clutter up the client with our own negative emotions. But I worry slightly that if this is true, that we might be missing certain opportunities to use our own emotions strategically, opportunities to bring our own negative emotional experiences to the table in a strategic way that might be in the service of the client. But I'm also not here to say somehow I disagree or say that coaches shouldn't be positive, because I do agree with things the coaches here have said, and I do believe that positivity is a wonderful and perhaps even crucial aspect of coaching. So let me wind up there. I know I've just said so much. Let me just throw it out to folks, see if they have questions.
Yeah, a couple of really interesting questions have been coming in, and interestingly, they were percolating in my mind too. So they're both my questions and the questions coming in from folks. And the first one is, to maybe comment on the subject of positive psychology in general. You know, you're talking about this valence frame of positive and negative, and yet when we as coaches, and I include myself in that, lead with this moniker or label that we are positive psychologists, I wonder if that has an impact on how the client expectation is set up, that we will potentially not deal with negative emotions. So that's that's the first thing.
That's great, and in fact, I'm going to limit it to that single question, just with an eye on the clock, because I think it's a great question.
Let me throw in the second one so you can do both at the same time then, because the other one is just real quick. I think people would like a clear definition from you about the difference between positive and negative emotion.
That's actually a pretty complicated answer.
Well, maybe take what
it's a little bit like saying, "Oh, define happiness," and it's like,
yeah.
well, you know, we could spend a lot of time on that. We generally look at negative emotion more or less as those that are unpleasant, but that's not always true, because we tend to put anger, which is a highly aroused and sometimes pleasant feeling negative emotion. So you can't just totally parse them in terms of pleasant and unpleasant, but you get the idea. We talk about guilt, sadness, anger on the negative end of the continuum. Many of those have to do with their effects on our sort of cognition and attention. And then we have things like love and affection and contentedness, harmony, joy, enthusiasm on the positive side. Those tend to be pleasant feeling. But again, I don't want anyone at all to think that I'm somehow preferencing one group over another. So let me use that as the segue into this question about positive psychology. It's a great question. First, I want to say this. I think when people hear positive psychology, they make a huge mistake. They hear it like this: positive psychology.
That's well done.
But that is not how I hear it at all. Yeah. I hear positive psychology. And what you're doing when you do positive psychology is you are tinkering with people's attitudes, emotions, identity, behaviors, self-concepts. That is, you're doing psychology. It just happens to be that you're focusing on what we would consider positive topics within psychology. I think the most important thing for coaches to remember then is that they have an ethical obligation to weigh positive psychology interventions with regards to their potential for harm. Because you can harm people with positive psychology interventions because you're not just doing something positive, you're doing psychology. So that you can see I'm a little bit on a soapbox there, but I think it's an important professional distinction because for me, positive doesn't mean we ignore the negative. I teach many courses for coaches on positive psychology application, and people ask this to me all the time, like, can't we just reframe people's weaknesses as strengths? Can't we just sort of, in my mind, do sort of dismiss people's negative emotions and say, oh, don't worry about those because you have such a great foundation of positive emotions upon which to draw. I think that is naive and unrealistic. I talk about weaknesses with my clients as much as I talk about strengths. I talk about anger and sadness. I think that they're extraordinarily useful. I want people to experience them. I think that one of the unintended byproducts of positive psychology is that we have made little room for so-called negative psychology. I've had people, in fact, I came to Harvard some years ago to do some consulting there. There was sort of a happiness think tank one afternoon, and I met with a woman who said, and this is just so, this is true. I mean, it sounds like I'm making the story up, but it's so indicative of the climate to me. She said, my dog died this morning and you're a happiness expert and I want to know what I can do to be happy. And I just said, you absolutely shouldn't be happy. Why on earth would you be happy about that? Like, I want to validate and legitimize sadness as an emotional state. It is part of your natural psychological architecture. It's part of a wonderful palette of emotion that makes life rich and understandable. You're not going to get stuck that way. You're not going to be sad 8 years from now because your dog died today. Don't worry. Go ahead and feel some sadness, and you can withstand it, and that's okay. So I'm not eager to just brush past this stuff. So I guess that's my answer to that.
That's really great, Robert, and it's prompting a couple of additional follow-ups. So and up to you as to whether you want to take them, but just
I can't take them.
Okay, let's move on, and I'll hold them because the people are reflecting really well on this. So you go ahead, and we'll get back to these questions.
Yeah. It's not that I don't think they're legitimate. It's that I want to get to at least some of this other stuff, and I know that we could probably just spend the rest of our time talking about this one thing.
No,
so let's talk a little bit about the role of emotion. This actually might address some of the thoughts people have. I like to start by saying, who would you rather take a road trip with? Imagine that you had to take a 1,000-kilometer road trip. You are in the driver's seat, and you get a navigator spending all this time cooped up in the car with you. Do you want to be with Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock? And as the pictures are suggestive, Captain Kirk is just this ball of passions and emotion. And Mr. Spock is sort of this calculating, logical machine. And although it's sort of a humorous way to approach it, I actually mean that. Like, look, which of those feels more comfortable to you? And I know that we have smart people on the line and coaches, and so they're going to say things like, well, it depends. And that's absolutely true. It does depend. And it depends on what you want. If you want someone who, while you're lost in city traffic, can kind of detach themselves and be a cool navigator, you probably want Spock. But if you want someone that can throw themselves in new experiences and tolerate discomfort, you probably want Kirk. And so both of them are pretty cool. And yet, for many people, they have a distinct prejudice against emotion. They're sort of anti-Kirk in a way. And I think that this is long-standing. I don't think it's related to Star Trek. I think it goes back to ancient Greece. I think that we find with, for example, Stoics and other brands of philosophers, not the hedonists, but the Stoics and others, this idea that emotions are our lower aspects of our human nature. They're our animal side. But really what we want is to rise above it and think things through. And in fact, that's what a lot of coaching is. We heavily preference noticing, attention, goal setting, planning. Those are all higher order executive cognitive functions. But what about experience, trial and error, be steeped in emotion. Yes, we do those, of course. But I think we could do them even more or plumb them for more than they're worth. So a lot of the common prejudices, especially against negative emotions, one is that they're unpleasant. I write in my book, The Upside of Your Dark Side, one of my favorite lines is, people avoid feeling crappy because feeling crappy feels crappy. That is, it just feels unpleasant to be guilty or to be nervous. And so we avoid it. But I don't think we need to avoid it just because it feels bad. When you book an overseas vacation, you know that you're going to feel self-conscious, you know that you're going to get lost, you know that you're going to be nervous, and you assume that as part of the learning and growth experience of, let's say, international travel. So I don't think we need to worry about the yuck factor quite as much as we do. I also believe that people are prejudiced because they believe that emotions are like quicksand, that we are going to get stuck there, that it's somehow permanent, especially with regards to anger. Oh no, no one would ever want to feel anger. And people, they literally send me emails, things like, there's never a legitimate reason for an individual to feel or express anger. This is the kind of stuff I'm hearing. And I cannot tell you how vehemently I disagree with that argument. It's like, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So as counter evidence for emotion being like quicksand and getting you stuck there, I'd just like to point out that everyone who's listening in right now has been angry at some point in their life. And you're not probably angry right now. That is, something happened between that time you got angry and now where you became less angry. Moods last, and sometimes they last an afternoon. Sometimes, as in the case of some clinical states, they can last for some weeks. But more often than not, they last about a half hour. They're just a whole lot less permanent than we give them credit. People are also afraid of the berserk factor. That is, that somehow that emotions are going to be the tsunami that just spills over us and carries us away and makes us act out in ways that are out of control. And then people lastly look at social consequences, and I believe that this is perhaps the best criticism of especially powerful and negative emotions, that they could potentially have social consequences, that by being a chronic complainer, by being prone to aggression, you will have social consequences, and so I think that's worth looking at. But what I want to do is circle back and just look at what psychologists say about emotion. In the 1980s, Bob Wire and Jerry Clore, both who at that time were at the University of Illinois, a powerhouse of emotion research at the time, I think rated the #2 psych program in the world during that decade. I believe that that they brought forth a really wonderful and complementary set of theories about emotion. One is called mood as inputs, and the other is called mood as information. For our purposes here, I'm just going to call it mood as information. That is, when you feel an emotion, that's just like a radar tracking signal for life. That's just giving you feedback via an emotional channel, kind of a mental thumbs up or thumbs down about the quality of the situation you're in. That's fundamentally what emotions are about. Yes, they have social nature. Yes, we make appraisals about them. Yes, they differ cross-culturally. Yes, they might lead to certain functions, like have motivational consequences. But really what they are is just a thermometer taking the temperature of your day. And so for people who say it's never okay to feel anger, they are, in my mind, saying what I would like to do is break my thermometer so that it only measures a few degrees. And positive psychology coaches who say we can only attend to the positive end of the spectrum, that's like saying we're only going to look at temperatures above freezing. We would never want to look at any temperature below freezing. But I'm like, hey, this thing's a thermometer. Why not use all the information it has to give you? And so all of these emotions, in my mind, have some real functional value. Fear serves a purpose. It helps make us more vigilant. It helps raises our guard. It tells you that there's a threat out there. And by and large, our emotion systems are pretty valid. Yeah, we can go off base sometimes, we can go wrong with them, but they're accurate more often than not. Guilt. I'm a huge fan of guilt. I love it. I would hate to live in a society where people were incapable of feeling guilt. Guilt tells you that you violated your own moral or ethical code and that you need a course correction. Even sadness has a function. Sadness helps you to conserve your resources. It's a drawing in. It's an introspection. It's saying, let's just call a timeout. And I think that's really helpful. And I'm drawing a distinction here between sadness and depression. I think sadness is really, really useful. It's just saying, let's put everything on pause for a moment and conserve. Anger, probably, I mean, it is one of the richest and among my most favorite of emotions. Anger is protective. You feel angry when someone you love, an ideal, your property, or your person come under threat. And anger physiologically pumps blood to your extremities, prepares you for action. It prepares you verbally, cognitively, physically to protect those things you care so deeply about. On the positive side, love. Love and affection helps bond us to others. It's associated with the release of oxytocin, as probably most people know, which is a bonding agent, if you will. Joy is sort of a self-reinforcement loop. It kind of says, hey, thumbs up, everything's going well. Let's continue on this track. Surprise is interesting because it refocuses your attention. It says, hey, we had a certain expectation timeline and something happened that deviated from our expectation. Let's start paying attention to it. So here we have negative emotions, positive emotions. They all provide useful information. Now, when we actually go out and sample people, we find that people spend about 80% of the time feeling positive emotions and about 20% of the time feeling negative emotions. We find this across cultures. I think that this is pretty good. Most people on the line who are aligned, on this line who are aligned with positive psychology and coaching will recognize the idea of broaden and build theory. That is the theory that the positive emotions serve to broaden and build, to open our cognitive and behavioral repertoire, our attention. That is, in the absence of threat, our natural resting state is when we feel mildly positive. It makes us more curious, more exploratory, more inventive, more sociable. And negative emotions serve to do exactly the opposite. They narrow our cognitive, behavioral, our attentional repertoire. We don't want to have a huge menu list of options to do in these tough situations, so instead it narrows us to things like fight or flight or fright. And that, I think, is a good distinction functionally between positive and negative emotions, the narrowing versus broadening aspect. I will just take it a step further for those of you who are already familiar with broaden and build. One of the ways that broaden and build works is what I just alluded to is via something called positivity offset. That is, broaden and build as an evolutionary theory would not work if people's natural resting state was neutral. It only works because we have positivity offset. That is, we are mildly happy most of the time. Our natural resting state is above neutral. And because of that, we are able to experience all these evolutionary advantages, being more creative, being developing bonds with kin groups or out-group members, being more exploratory and so forth, and therefore more likely to be able to survive tough situations, pass on our genes, et cetera, et cetera. Positivity offset, another piece of evidence for it is just that we are likely to interpret neutral stimuli as positive. So if I show you an ice cream cone, most people sort of give it a mental thumbs up. If I show you a hideously deformed person, people kind of give that a thumbs down. If I show you something neutral like a chair, people give it a thumbs up. Something that is essentially neutral and actually has been rated as neutral by other people, people react to it physiologically in the same way that they react to positive stimuli. So that's mood as information theory, and I think that is sort of at the heart of this entire presentation and is great for coaches to know. I'm going to move on to something else that I think is pretty cool for coaches to know, and this is looking at looking at two different dimensions. Here we have arousal or activity, high arousal activity, low arousal activity, and then valence, or the evaluation of the emotion, positive emotion and negative emotion. So over here, we have high arousal, positive emotion. Things like excited, self-confidence, enthusiastic, delighted, joyous. And people who hail from individualistic cultures, think Canada, Australia, the United States, this is what we shoot for. This is what we aspire to in terms of our cultural norms. And we have learned these norms. You can look at children's books and see that they promote these as emotional norms. And you can compare that with people who hail from collectivist cultures, places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And here we have low arousal positive emotions, feeling contented, relaxed, serene, connected, feeling a sense of harmony or peace. And you can look at children's books from Taiwan, for example, and see that those are the emotions that are promoted in those books. So these are socialized to us culturally. And I just want to mention that I don't believe that one is the true positive emotion and the other isn't. Sometimes people say, oh, contentedness or peace is the real positive emotion. It's enduring, but joy is just fleeting. I just want to say, nope. All we're talking about is cultural leanings towards what people believe is normative and what they aspire to. This group and this group are no fundamentally better than one another. People from both cultures can feel all of them. People from one culture tend towards one. People from the other culture tend towards another. But I think it is good to know, because when you do things like track energy as a coach, you can understand that culture will affect, or at least will reasonably likely affect the way that your client expresses his or her own emotion. Let's stop there and ask for questions. I've said a lot, and hopefully a couple of important things.
Yeah, I think you've said a lot of important things. If I can speak for myself and for perhaps the bulk of the folks that are listening, we've had, I would say, kind of two or three. I try to group these questions together, and because there's a lot of overlap, as you would imagine. But one of the themes that's coming back, Robert, is about how the coach brings their own emotions or their own emotional state into the container of coaching. And you spoke a little bit about this, but you might want to comment more. One aspect of a question is whether or not just bringing the positivity from the coach is sometimes about looking for the client's approval, trying to make the client happy by being happy, and actually, in that sense, almost missing the boat about the real situation that's going on.
Yeah.
And another question that's along those same lines is, if the coach is actually avoiding using negative emotions, or expressing their own feelings at times, if they're feeling negative, then they're not actually being transparent with the client. So there may actually be a lack of integrity between the two at some point.
I love both sort of thematic directions. So let's start with that second point. Absolutely, I'm of the opinion that coaches are people that you can't just facilitate in some broad abstract way as if you're not there. That you do lead the client. I don't mean advise the client, but by virtue of every question you ask, you're opening a door that goes one direction or another. So you are impacting the outcome and direction of coaching. And I think you're bringing your real self to the table is paramount. I'll tell you, this is a positive emotion example, but it happened to me 2 days ago. A client said to me, essentially, I'm having a really hard time structuring my evening, and I'm not really getting to bed on time. I'm not sleeping well. So really, what I need to do is kind of create a schedule. And in my my mind, I had already thought lots of stuff, right? Okay, well, she, probably wants to get a workout in, or maybe has to put the kids to bed, or, like all those type of evening activities that all of us are grappling with. And I said, okay, so, tell me what's standing in the way of bedtime right now. And she said, oh, I just watch TV, that's all. And I was so surprised. I was shocked. I mean, it wasn't at all what I expected. I thought that we were going to be like, when she said, I need to schedule things, like I thought we were going to have like 50 moving parts that we were going to have to prioritize and juggle. And she just said, oh, it's just TV. And so I just said, oh, I'm so surprised to hear that, because that was communicating my authentic emotion. And then I just said, I thought we were going to have 50 moving parts, that you were going to tell me about workouts and kids and checking email and like all this stuff. And you just said it's just TV. Like, I'm just surprised. And hearing how surprised I was by it, I think actually facilitated some perspective in the client. Kind of like, oh, wait, this isn't an insurmountable, huge issue with complicated variables. It's a single issue, what to do about TV, and as such, is much more, much easier to deal with perhaps than I initially gave it credit. So I believe that there are strategic ways that coaches can show up themselves as full humans. One of the things I hate the most in coaching, and I know that I myself am guilty of it sometimes, is this active listening strategy of repeating what the client just said. It drives me crazy. So what I hear you saying is that you really want to switch careers. Well, yeah, I just said that. Of course that's what you hear me saying, and I said it in exactly those words. And so when I train coaches on deep level listening, what I say is a much better way to have your client know that you heard them and understand them is just to react naturally to it. If they said something funny, try laughing. If they said something that pulls at your heartstrings, express concern. But you don't just have to parrot back to them what they said as a means of active listening. There are good times to do that, for example, for clarification purposes. But generally, I think just react honestly with your own emotion is a wonderful way to communicate with people. It's almost like just saying, like, do what comes naturally, just be human. And we've kind of taken some of that, in some ways, out of the coaching interaction. And I'd like to just put it back in.
It's a very interesting perspective, because you're raising the issue of the line between being sort of strategic as a coach and how you bring your emotional response or your questioning, your listening into the container with the client versus how you just show up as yourself, as your real response, as your real human being.
Yeah,
it's not always easy to know which is the right thing to do, I think, for us.
And I'll be the first to admit I don't have the golden answer or the perfect formula for it. That's why I'm not here to convince you. I'm just here to offer some of this to you. I will say Christian van Nieuwenburg, who a wonderful coach, runs the coaching psychology program at University of East London. He says, apart from technical skill and models that guide our coaching, we have this whole sort of coaching presence idea. That is what he calls ways of being. And being authentic, being expressive, being yourself, being humble but being confident, those elements are huge areas of professional and personal development for coaches. Understanding your own prejudices, like why you don't feel comfortable with your client's apprehension, why you're trying to rush them into positivity. I think that's a great thing for coaches to know about. So just what I'm going to do, I want to make sure we get to the skill. So I'm going to just say this one thing, I'm going to shift to the skill, and then we won't do the fourth part because I know this is an engaged group, and we'll use whatever minutes we have because I want to make sure we get to some questions. But I'll tell you that when I wrote this most recent book, it totally changed my parenting. And in the past, I would have parented my son. I'm going to use him as an example. Jedi, he's a 16-year-old, and he loves rock climbing. I just use it to give us a real example. In the past, if he weren't able to go rock climbing and felt disappointed, I would have said something that was basically dismissive of him feeling disappointed. I would have said, oh, you don't need to feel that way because we'll climb for twice as long this weekend. Or don't worry that you can't go tonight because we'll go tomorrow. And essentially it's just saying, don't feel that way. Don't feel disappointed. And I have changed 180 degrees on that position with regards to negative emotion. Now what I'm likely to say to him is, oh, you're feeling disappointed, and that's totally understandable. I just validate the emotion, and I don't try and talk him out of it. Because I think ultimately it's going to make him tolerate negative emotion better, be able to use negative emotion, identify negative emotion, i.e. I think it's going to make him more emotionally intelligent. And because emotional intelligence is something that is very skills-based and that we do with leaders and that we do with our coaching clients, I think that making sure we're using the whole range is important. So what I would like to talk to you about with regards to the one emotional skill is something called emotion differentiation. Emotion differentiation is essentially a spectrum. Let me just jump back here. It's a spectrum. On sort of the left-hand side of the continuum, you get people who can't really identify an emotion. I don't know, I feel good. I don't like it. It's bad. Like that. Like they're not very articulate with regards to emotion. Somewhere in the middle of the continuum, you get the rest of us. And that is, we can label an emotion. I feel afraid. I'm in love. And we can kind of saddle our experience with a single label. But over on the right-hand side of the continuum, you get this awesome differentiation that you understand that it's this melange of complex appraisals that all fit together and that we don't just experience one emotion at a time. I feel a little bit nervous, but maybe excited and curious. And the people who can do that function better. Among college students, when they do that, they drink 40% less alcohol when they can do it around negative emotions. Differentiate them. When they differentiate it, they actually pick up in the fMRI machine stimulation in the anterior cingulate. If you're a huge fan of having your anterior cingulate stimulated, you'll be glad to know that. But basically it says we actually can see something happening in the brain when you're doing this. And I just want to show you here, these are people who, if you look at the x-axis, the horizontal axis at the bottom, folks who are prone to low daily anger are folks who are prone to high daily anger. And you know some of these people, short fuse people, high daily anger people. But then there's two lines, and those lines represent people who are good at emotional differentiation and people who are bad at emotional differentiation. And you can see on the y-axis, the vertical axis, how many pieces of daily aggression they have. How much do they actually act out aggressively? And check this out. People who are good at differentiating their emotions, who are high daily angry people. These are people with a short fuse who are kind of, you think of them as jerks, but if they're good at emotional differentiation, they act out less aggressively than the people who are low in daily anger, who are bad at emotional differentiation. Being able to differentiate emotions turns out to be awesome, and here is possibly an opportunity for coaches to comment by modeling the skill, by actively working with clients on the skill. So what I'm going to do, and here's our demonstration of this, our activity, I'm going to read you a passage. And I want you, again, close down that Facebook account, put down the bourbon, get out your pencil, and I want you to just listen to this passage. And I want you to write down all the different feelings that you feel. And this is a good example of emotional differentiation, because there won't just be a single feeling in here. And for some of you, it'll be a little bit hard to do this, because it'll push you to look beyond a single feeling. And for some of you, this will come easily. So sit back, buckle in, and I'm going to read to you from the journal of a Swiss person, Bertrand Piccard. He was one of two men who was the first to sail this balloon around the world, the circumnavigation of the planet Earth without ever touching down. And this is his journal entry from the night before they landed, the night before they made history for this epic journey. Here we go. During the last night, I savor once more the intimate relationship we've established with our planet. Shivering in the pilot's seat, I have the feeling that I've left the capsule to fly under the stars that have swallowed our balloon. I feel so privileged that I want to enjoy every second of this air world. During our 3 weeks of flight, protected by our high-tech cocoon, we've flown over millions of people suffering on this earth. Why are we so lucky? Very shortly, after daybreak, our balloon will land in the Egyptian sand. Brian and I will be lifted away from the desert by helicopter, and we'll immediately need to find words to satisfy the public's curiosity. But right now, muffled in my down jacket, I let the cold bite of the night remind me that I have not yet landed, that I am still living one of the most beautiful moments of my life. The only way I can make this instant last will be to share it with others. I'll give you just a second to reflect on your emotional experience, your emotional connection to this passage. I have, of course, chosen this passage because I think it's a wonderful example of a passage that is evocative of many different types of emotions. So hopefully a good piece of stimuli for you to practice this particular skill. And with that said, and with 8 minutes on the clock, I would like to just back up and give you as much floor space as you need to react, to offer insights, or ask questions.
I'm going to jump in here and just let you know that I'm having I'm having to breathe myself, and just allow, I really appreciate the exercise, just allowing hopefully all of us to really flow. I mean, what I was watching myself do was flow through a multitude of emotions in less than 3 minutes, 2 minutes, from joy to awe to sadness. I mean, the sentence about floating over millions of people suffering is extremely poignant. Can't imagine anyone listening not being touched. And it's interesting how you can have those expressions, you can actually feel joy and sorrow at the same time almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so wonderful. I mean, you're essentially being hopefully the mouthpiece for the group here, Jeff.
I'm not sure that's appropriate, but that's what's
happening. Well, I'm going to sample you with it. So. But I mean, that certainly is, when I read it, that's what happens to me as well. I feel you use the word touch, you use the word poignant, and that these are sort of umbrella terms that allow more room for things like, yeah, I felt somehow like deeply privileged and appreciative, even at the same time as I felt sad and compassion. And it really is kind of a wonderful passage in that it just illustrates, I think quite powerfully, how complex our emotional states really are. And to be honest, how much kind of short shrift we give them by just labeling them with these kind of simplistic I feel statements. Oh, you're sad.
And how quickly they change.
Yeah, absolutely. So now imagine what you can get in let's say, a 60-minute or a 45-minute coaching session where people are running the gamut of confusion, surprise, humor and playfulness, joy, optimism, frustration, and how much room that you can make in a session for that.
Yeah, in fact, that's a really great segue to a couple of very practical questions that came in during the session. It might be good for you to just share your thoughts on them. 2 or 3 people mentioned wondering how you would recommend approaching a client that's trying to make a change but struggling either with guilt, embarrassment, shame. In other words, the client is coming into the session, one person mentioned wanting to quit smoking or wanting to change something, and they're having a lot of negative emotions around it. And so as the coach, what practical tips would you think about in terms of how to either move them through that or deal with it or approach it?
Oop. Let me go back to previous. So I think there's a lot that we can practically do as coaches. So one of the things I like to do is normalize and accept their experiences. You're, let's say, quitting smoking, that's the example you used, and you're feeling guilty about it because this is actually your 8th attempt. And every time you kind of feel like you're setting yourself up for failure and that you owe it to other people and that maybe you're not strong and you just feel self-conscious about it, a little guilty about it. Do you see how I'm already taking that guilt as a single label and I just added self-consciousness to it? So I'm beginning the process of emotion differentiation. And from there, it's a short step to say, and you could also feel guilt and optimism, or guilt and guarded excitement, and apprehension, and a little bit of fear and nervousness. And as soon as you start parsing those apart, it turns out when you do this with negative emotions, it sort of undermines their toxic quality. So it's helpful to do this. You can do it for the client. You can ask questions that usher the client through it, but also you're validating the client for his or her own emotional experiences. I believe that you can work with clients to track their emotional experiences. I do a lot of this. At the end of the day, take a daily diary. How did you feel on various, how energetic did you feel? How joyful did you feel? How deflated or apprehensive did you feel on a 1 to 10 scale? What were the particular episodes of the day that you most associate with that particular feeling and that particular emotion? Why don't you do this every single day? And it's a great, if we think about the ICF core competency of basically promoting client awareness, this is a great tool for client awareness. They can say, oh, I recognize on Tuesday where I'm doing a lot of task switching, I feel really deflated. Or on Fridays when I'm doing a lot of creative kind of stuff, I feel really energized. I think that's a great thing for them to understand. And then I think there's a bunch of things on our own side that it's good for coaches to do. Understand just the nature of emotions, that all emotions can be functional. They tend to be accurate. They're not always accurate. Understand your own attitudes towards emotions. Which are the emotions you're comfortable with? If someone cries in front of you, do you not know what to do with that? Does that make you uncomfortable, or are you pretty okay with it? How do you use your own emotional experiences, as we discussed before? So I think there are a number of ways, and this actually isn't even that specific or fleshed out. So I don't think I'm the final authority on this. I think I'm just someone who's thinking about this.
Well, I think a nice way to sort of wind down, because I want to thank you for, at least for myself, and I want to speak, as much as appropriate for the group, but I think what you've done is raise our emotional awareness that as coaches, it's not just about the feelings going on the other side of with the client. It's also the feelings, the emotions, the access, the variability, the flow that's going on within us as coaches. And that, at least you've given me a lot to think about. Oh, how do I use that? How do I bring that to the table? Where is it appropriate? How? And there are so many different tools and opportunities to think it through. And as you said, there's no right or wrong answer, but just raising that awareness in all of us is really incredibly valuable. I have the list of questions that I could go on is quite extensive. So what I'd like to do, Robert, if you're open to it, is to collect these questions. And those of you that have additional questions that we weren't able to get to, we're going to send these on to him. And Stephanie will provide contact information. And in fact, maybe you want to share, Robert, just as a closing, the best way to reach you. But we will forward some of these questions. So if you want to be in dialogue with Robert, if he's raised some deep thinking for you, you can continue the conversation. So what's the best place for people to find you?
Sure. So I have two websites. One is positiveacorn.com, and my email is robert@positiveacorn.com. And you can also download PDFs of my research at intentionalhappiness.com. So two different sites, and my email, robert@positiveacorn.com.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank your voice for holding out, and you continue to sound great all the way through, so there's some level of positivity that was working its way through your larynx.
Great, thank you.
I hope you feel better, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but as I said, we will forward them on to Robert, and I know he's open to continuing the dialogue. So everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you or hearing from you again on our next webinar. Take care. Bye now.